Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Trumbore with your nightly review for Thursday, April 18. It is 4:02 p.m. Eastern Time. Awaiting earnings for Google, IBM, and Microsoft. During the regular session, Google was down $15, IBM down $2, Microsoft unchanged. For the day, the Dow Jones finished down 79 points. So here's how the week has gone. Down 265 on Monday, up 157 on Tuesday, down 138 on Wednesday, down 79 today. Actually, as it settles out, down 81 to 14,537. S&P finished down 0.7%. NASDAQ down 1.2%. Of the first 81, as of about midday, of the first 81 S&P 500 companies reporting earnings, only 49% exceeded revenue forecast. I think about 74% exceeded on the bottom line, but only 49% on the top line. Pepsi did well today, though. Beat earnings. Revenues were up 4.4% when you took into effect fluctuations in currency and some things they were doing in switching businesses around, or the labeling of businesses in China. But I bring it up because while Pepsi shares were up over $2 on the day, it has now a trailing PE of 21, just like Coke after they reported the other day, and Johnson & Johnson. It's just kind of funny. All three of them, the day they reported earnings, and in all three cases they beat, all now have trailing PEs of about 21. Again, I'm not saying they go down, but for those kinds of stocks, that's not cheap. And even if 2013 earnings for the year come in as expected, they trade at multiples then of 15 or 16 going forward. Philip Morris disappointed. Revenues were up only 2%, but more importantly, volume dropped. They had price increases on some of their cigarettes, I believe. Morgan Stanley did not perform well today. Its revenue was down versus last year. Shares in Apple closed today at $391.75. Microsoft is slightly shy on revenues. I need to plow through all this. I'll be covering everything in Week in Review. Apple, so $391, crashing through 400, actually hit $389 earlier in the day. Bloomberg had a good piece. This is by Adam Satariano. Apple's breakneck growth to $156.5 billion in revenue last year from $24.6 billion in 2007. $24.6 billion in revenue in 2007. $156 billion last year. The breakneck growth as a result when the iPhone debuted back in 2007 supports an ecosystem of at least 247 suppliers across the globe. They rely on Apple to deliver $30.1 billion in orders in the latest reported quarter, according to supply chain data compiled by Bloomberg. As a result, many of these suppliers are now vulnerable after building up inventory in anticipation of continued growth. According to Michael Hassler, a lecturer at the University of Texas in Austin, he had been former supply chain executive at Applied Materials. He said this is the downside of that really positive story of being an Apple supplier. And of course, yesterday we saw that with the stock price of Cirrus Logic. Nokia their shares fell 11% today, 11% from down to about $3.15 from roughly $3.60. The Finnish mobile phone maker reported its smallest quarterly revenue in 13 years as handset demand waned. It's getting competition from phones using Google's Android software. Demand for Nokia's Lumia smartphones isn't enough to offset plummeting demand for the company's cheaper models. Fed Governor Jeffrey Lacker of Richmond gave an interview with CNBC and talked of 2% growth being the trend for this foreseeable future. If we just print, we might print 3% in the first quarter, but everybody knows the second quarter is much weaker. And if we do 2% this year and 2% next year and 2% in 2015, that's not going to be good. It's certainly not going to be good for small business. This is this week's Crain's New York business. And the title of the story is Feeling the Squeeze, Not Just Paid Sick Days, Rash of Regs Jacks Up Cost, Stifles Growth. This is by Ali Elkin. Stephen Werder woke up March 29 to discover the cost of doing business in New York had risen again. Next year, the owner of Wink Fashion Boutiques will shell out around $220,000 before he sells a single sundress. The night before, City Council Speaker Christine Quinn, who's running for mayor, I kind of like Christine, and labor leaders had hammered out a deal that would require thousands of small businesses to offer workers 5 paid days off a year. For Mr. Werder, that means an additional $80,000 after he'd already budgeted an extra $140,000 to comply with the new federal health insurance mandate. Excuse me. The veto-proof sick days proposal applies to businesses with at least 20 employees starting next year and expands to cover firms with at least 15 employees in 2015. Each employee would get up to 5 paid sick days. Of course, the measure has its supporters, but the benefits may be hard to calculate. The costs, however, are not. Wink's Mr. Werder has about 80 employees at 3 stores in New York City. 5 days a year comes out to about $1,000 per employee. I'd say, yeah, that's how small business gets squeezed. Okay, overseas. London and Paris, their markets were unchanged, but they've been down 4 days in a row. Frankfurt was down again, 0.4%. In the UK, retail sales fell 0.7% in March from February, owing to cold weather there. In Japan, March exports were up 1.1% from a year earlier, better than expected, but exports to China fell 2.5%, while those to the European Union declined 4.7%. That is significant. Shipments to the US, however, rose 7%. So again, that was for March versus a year earlier. Turning to Italy and their election, and I apologize, this is confusing. Let's start with last night and work forward. Okay, last night supposedly Piero Luigi Bersani, the center-left Democrat leader, had reached an agreement with the center-right's former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi on the election by Parliament today, Thursday, on the country's next president. This would be the fellow who replaces 87-year-old Giorgio Napolitano, whose term expires in mid-May. Senior parliamentarians said that an agreement had been made on the candidacy of Franco Marini, an 80-year-old former Speaker of the Senate. Napolitano is retiring at 87. His term 7-year term ends. He's 87, and they want to bring in Franco Marini, who's 80. And this is an important position because the president, who has a lot of say in setting up the new government, and the next president has to break this deadlock they have in Italy. They haven't had a government since the election February 24th and 25th. So Berlusconi's People of the Liberty Party hopes that the agreement on Mr. Marini will pave the way for a grand coalition between Berlusconi and Bersani, but Bersani, remember, doesn't want to be in a coalition with Berlusconi. Matteo Renzi, and you might recall, he's the mayor of Florence. I think he's 38. He's challenged Bersani for the party leadership. He said last night that this agreement, supposedly for Marini, was disrespectful for the country. So Renzi, who controls about 90 of Bersani's coalition of those seats, said he wouldn't vote for Marini. I have a block on that tape. So here's what happened then today. They had 2 votes. You need 2/3 of a majority to win in the first 3 rounds, and then if it goes to a 4th round, then it drops down to a simple majority. I think I have this right. So Franco Marini fell well short of the 2/3 majority in the first 2 rounds today, and voting resumes on Friday. The majority of MPs are reported to have cast blank ballots in the second round of voting today to buy time for consultations before the voting resumes. So that's just a mess. And speaking of a mess, in Greece today, about 30 migrant workers were injured in a shooting on a strawberry farm after they requested that their salaries be paid. These poor guys, and it's part of a group of about 200 working this farm, they just haven't been paid. So 200 gathered to request their unpaid salaries when at least one farm supervisor opened fire on them. Apparently, none are in critical condition, but at least 30 were hit. IMF chief Christine Lagarde has been summoned by a French court to answer questions over alleged abuse of office during her time as France's finance minister. This issue came up about 4 weeks ago. Lagarde is to be questioned in May over her role in the awarding of financial compensation to businessman Bernard Tapie in 2008. There's speculation that Lagarde could yet be placed under formal investigation. Investigators suspect Tapie was granted a deal. Again, this was for like 400 million euro. So over half $500 million. Tapie was granted the deal in return for his support of President Sarkozy, supposedly. All right, big goings on in China. A top mainland scientist said 40% of the people who have tested positive for the new H7N9 bird flu strain had no recent contact with poultry. Let me repeat, 40% of the people who have tested positive had no recent contact with poultry, so it's still unclear how they contracted the virus. As of this morning, there were at least 82 confirmed cases in China with 17 fatalities. The remark by Dr. Zheng Guang, chief of epidemiology at the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, came as Shanghai and Zhejiang authorities announced 5 new cases. So Dr. Zhang said, how were they infected? It is still a mystery. He was quoted in the Beijing News. Professor Zhu Yu, a biologist at Huazhong University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, said researchers believe the deadly virus evolved after Chinese birds came in contact with birds from East Asian countries such as South Korea. One new case involves a 4-year-old who tested positive for the flu virus without showing any symptoms. A World Health Organization official in Geneva said the child might have caught it from close and prolonged contact with one of the other patients. Peter Hotez, Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor in Houston, said, "I think we're in unknown territory. The risk is that the H7N9 virus mutates so that it no longer just jumps from birds to people, but starts to go from people to people, as in all flu pandemics." So there's no evidence this has happened yet, but it's something that requires vigilance. So far, China's poultry sector has sustained losses of more than 1.6 billion. You have to go back to February of 2003, and actually latter part of 2002 when the SARS epidemic first hit. It wasn't until 2003 that the Chinese government made it official. SARS killed 775 people in 37 countries. But from an economic standpoint, SARS impact was 40 billion in economic losses, and of course the Asian economy was, in certain sectors like travel and tourism, was shut down. Unless there are confirmed cases of transmission between humans, the bird flu will only marginally increase the downside risk to economic growth, said Sun Chi, Hong Kong-based economist at Daiwa Capital Markets. But that's as long as there are no confirmed cases of transmission between humans. Chinese government is not covering things up as best as I can determine, which was the case with SARS in 2002-2003. Finally, the Pentagon is sending about 200 troops to Jordan, the vanguard of a potential U.S. military force of 20,000 or more that could be deployed if the Obama administration decides to intervene in Syria to secure chemical weapons arsenals or to prevent the 2-year-old civil war from spreading to the neighbors. That's important. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel is scheduled to visit the Middle East next week with stops in Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, and the trip is almost solely going to be focusing on Syria. That's all for this week. I'll be back with you Monday. As you know, I write Week in Review on Fridays and post it early Saturday morning. Check it out. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.